I will ask Andrei Kurkov of Ukrainian PEN. Could you tell us about Oleg Sentsov case and what's known about him later?
Good afternoon. I think his case is very well known all around the world now, and this is a typical case of propaganda used to criminalize the thought and political opinion, and to present actually a person with different political opinion as a criminal, which is sentenced to 20 years for terrorist plans that he never had. He is not the only prisoner of conscience from Ukraine in Russian prisons. We have more than 80 of them, and now plus to these political prisoners we have also prisoners of war, which are not presented or accepted as prisoners of war, but presented to the Russian society as people who broke the Russian legislation about crossing the Russian borders in the places where there are no Russian borders, in the Black Sea. But I mean, this is only one aspect of huge problem we have, because I travel practically 6 months every year, and I noticed already some time ago that it is much easier to explain what is happening in Ukraine or between Ukraine and Russia abroad than sometimes even in some regions of Ukraine. Because if the world was divided into writers and readers, everything would be excellent. The readers would influence the writers, writers would decide which readers would decide which writers to trust, and so I mean the public opinion would be shaped by people of idea, and not people with I would say plans or secret plans. But I mean we have a small society of writers, a not very big society of readers, and majority of people who are TV watchers. And I mean, with TV, it's even impossible now to fight with Russian propaganda coming into Ukrainian TV broadcasting programs, sometimes by mistake, sometimes purposely for the political reasons. And I was 3 weeks ago in Lugansk, in Donbass area, in Lugansk region, where people are slowly coming back to their senses and they understand where is the truth, and they don't want this war, but also they don't want the occupied by separatist territories to be occupied anymore. But they don't have access even to commercial Ukrainian TV channels. In Stanitsa Luganskaya they can watch only Russian or separatist TV, which means that they are getting information about Ukraine and Ukrainian politics from abroad, and not from just abroad, but from actually our enemy, political enemy. The Sentsov case, as well as 50 cases of Crimean Tatars and of other Ukrainians and Ukrainian citizens, I mean, they are just showing that any pressure on Russian government or on Putin personally is not working at that time. So we need actually to have a system of re-education or re-information for our own citizens first of all. And we should of course stop to fight for the freedom for Sentsov and Kolchenko and others. And on Friday, thanks to Latvian PEN and members of European and Latvian Parliament, we had empty chairs action in front of the Russian embassy. But I think actually the propaganda issue is not only relevant to Ukrainian and Russian situation, it is relevant now everywhere in Europe, because there is no stability anymore, neither in Italy nor in France. It all started with annexation of Crimea somehow, and now the Gilets jaunes, the yellow gilets in France, sometimes they're pretending that they are followers of Ukrainian Maidan, which is this idea supported also by Russian media, to stress that this is anarchic and non-civilized movement which can destroy Europe. And I understand that actually any country in Europe, especially Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, should be on alert and should have their own ways to combat propaganda which is coming through Russian TV channels which are not blocked here. You can have access to any TV channel, to any information. The TV channels are first of all addressed to Russian speakers who are becoming, thanks to these channels, actually more loyal or even more loyal to the sources of information, to the country of this television. And sooner or later, Latvia will have to face the problem, the issue of loyalty and the issue of combating the propaganda, which will, maybe it will stop for some reason, but maybe it will increase.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. My next question will be to Mr. Bidenko. As I understand, 3 years ago was this Ministry of Information Policy established in Ukraine. Four already. And how do you see, is it possible in modern times to tell the truth from lies, to distillate the truth, or it's only a confrontation between two propagandas, right and wrong?
That's a very good example, because our ministry is not a ministry of truth and never was established as one. It was Russian propaganda to put this label on us. Our ministry appeared because in Ukraine we have a very complex system of government communications, of regulating media. There are, even in Parliament, we have two committees responsible for media. One is information committee, another one is a committee for freedom of speech. So everything is very complex, everything is oriented not on result but on talking. So our ministry was created as a body, as an authority, which can solve problems. Such problems as the absence of Ukrainian signal on the east, because TV towers were stolen by Russians and we didn't have another TV tower, so somebody has to build new ones. And before our ministry was created, everybody talked about that, nobody did anything. So it was like the commission within our ministry to begin working with that and building new TV towers. Another issue is connected with freedom of speech. So there is an online platform within the European Union about violations on freedom of speech, cases on violations. And our ministry is responsible for reacting on these cases on violations and gathering together Secretary's Office, Interior Affairs Ministry, other authorities to solve cases. So we are a kind of crisis solver, creating crisis communications, creating government communications offices, and trying to solve problems quickly. Like 2 years ago, we had a problem with public broadcaster. We needed to adopt several documents quickly before the end of the year so that public broadcaster could begin working. And nobody did that. Everybody talked about that. So the minister and cabinet of ministers in Ukraine is very authority of very high level of influence, very high level of power. So being a minister, you can do almost everything. So a minister first adopting these documents like in a week or two, and public broadcaster began functioning in time. So we are not that kind of ministry as France has, Minister of Communications, or Israel has. We are more a ministry of wartime, which resolves problems ad hoc when they appear, and there is no legal procedures to solve these problems. Then we come and solve these problems. But because minister himself is a media manager and we are a very young ministry, very small, we'll try to solve these problems actively and respecting freedom of speech and values of democracy. And that's how it works now in Ukraine. For example, talking about role of writers, we have a very big program of publishing books in Ukraine, because there is a research that shows the connection between number of libraries and the political culture in regions, for example. And in Ukraine, we have almost no libraries in the east, and we have a result which you know DNR and LNR in the east. And one of our goals, we see publishing and putting books, a lot of different books on history, culture, public affairs, fake news, to the people on the east, for them to read, because we think that reading influences political culture and influences how people understand how society works and how the state works. So last year we published more than 175 titles and almost 400,000 copies of books and put them to the east. So that's one of our important jobs that we see. But of course, when the war ends, there is no need for such ministry. There is a need for different agencies. Even now, we give some of our functions to agencies that appear. For example, Ukrainian Institute within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And for 3 years, we are working with translating tours into Ukrainian all over the world in museums. And now we are giving this function to the Ukrainian Institute. So we are a small ministry with not many functions, but solving ad hoc problems.
You said you publish books. Is it state published or private publishing houses?
We buy books with private companies. So I have like 2 examples here, Sensor Publications, and a book of Sergei Zakharov, it is translated, who was almost a year in the prison of DNR, and after that he wrote like a comic book about what is going on there. So these books are free. We give them free, so we can't sell them. Nobody can sell them, and we bring them in Ukrainian, in Russian to the east, and in other languages, in English, for example, to our partners here in Europe.
Do you see that the Russian side also is bringing their books to these regions?
Not many books, because it's difficult to bring a lot of books, for example, in Kramatorsk, but
Russians bring it to the separatist territories.
Sure, of course. They have a lot of brochures, books, they have TV, radio. We compare incomparable things. They have billions of dollars invested into the media for tens of years, and we only began like 2 years ago to invest not as much money into the books, videos, newspapers. So we publish, for example, one newspaper for people living on the east, and separatists have tens of newspapers there in the great territory.
You had something to add?
Yes, I wanted to add that, you know, that in Donbass, in Lugansk and Donetsk region, there was always in the last 27 years artificially supported nostalgia about the Soviet past. And what is happening now that in Lugansk, for example, with Russian money, they are printing a magazine for children, for local children, with cartoons, with pictures, and with stories in comics like about Lugansk pioneers, like young children communists are fighting with the Ukrainian nationalists. So I mean, they are now being brainwashed from the very early years of life, and there are lots of publications like this. Apart from the books about Putin, about Great Russia, about history of Russian army and Russian victories. So I mean, most of the small bookshops that remained in Lugansk and Donetsk, I mean, they are filled with this kind of propaganda books brought from Russia and very cheap. I mean, they are more expensive in Russia than in separatist territories.
This was a very interesting connection you mentioned between a number of libraries and political culture in the region. And I would ask Inga, do you feel that your readers are more politically active, or do they understand life more when they read your books, your poetry, your novels?
First I wanted to thank Andrei Kurkov and Ukrainian Pens that they came to Riga and we could organize together this action of empty chairs on Friday. It was a great honor. And thank you as well for coming here and telling all this interesting and quite terrifying stuff as well. But about my readers, I don't know. They are clever. All who read my books are clever people. But when I thought about this day's discussion and about freedom of speech, I understood that part of my life I have spent quite lost and confused. But then when I found the strength to speak up and tell more real stories, then part of my readers and as well as literary society said that, okay, girl, we liked you before better, and still there are some people who are telling me that I'm too angry, or I have heard even that you are not kind anymore, it's such a pity. And I understood that I'm not convenient, and that's the thing with free speech, as I think that it's not convenient sometimes. Most of the time it's not convenient, because it's as when I was lost or more confused, I was more easy to control, yes, and so it's not convenient, not for readers, not for power, not for writers as well, because to say the real thing, not the truth, because I don't know about truth, but the real thing, to say to tell real story, writer need to work quite a lot, I think, and I liked what Maria Golubov said about, I liked all the stuff, but about Harry Potter, and I think it's a good example actually, because it's a story of abandoned boy, and a lot of us can, and actually it's free speech of this abandoned boy in form of novels. We can learn from this Harry Potter stuff that we need to make place for more and more stories, real stories of people. And PEN as organization should work to give more and more place for these stories of different people and discriminated people. And as individuals, we should read a lot and train our empathy and yes, and be more and work with equality of all people to live in better society.
Thank you. One more question about Ukrainian situation, and how do you feel? Do we abroad understand what's going on in Ukraine? Or about writers, is it? Of course, it's necessary to be translated, but what are you doing to be more translated in foreign languages, Western languages, and also to Russian language?
Well, my situation is quite specific. I write novels in Russian, but my books are banned in Russia for the second time. And it is now banned also to bring my books from Ukraine into Russian territory from 2014, from April. But I think...
So is it a formal ban or...?
It is formal because my Ukrainian publisher was sending my books to the bookshops in Moscow after 2008 when Russian publishers stopped publishing my books. And on 24th of April 2014, Russian customs stopped my books and sent them back, saying that I am on the blacklist of writers and my books are not welcomed anymore. So I can consider it as an official ban.
And I can add that we as a Ministry of Truth, which struggles Russian language, last year bought 2 different books in Russian by a day. For example, For Giving Them to the East.
Thank you, I didn't know this. I came to Latvia to find out.
Read the East and my done.
But your question about understanding the Ukrainian situation abroad is very important, and I will just very briefly give you my theory, which will help you to understand what happened and what is partially the reason for the situation in the East and in Crimea. An ideal society usually consists of 5 identical spaces. Geopolitical space, which shows the geographical state borders of the country. Financial space, this is actually the money circulating, the currency, national currency circulating in these borders. Legal space is the laws, the same laws are applied in these borders. And then we have 2 very important spaces which are not very often talked about. Information space. It should be the same sources of information should work for this geopolitical space and cultural space. And in Donbass and in Crimea, they had legal, geopolitical and financial space. They were in these 3 spaces of Ukraine, and information space of Donbass and Crimea belonged to Russian territory, and cultural space also. And as I mentioned, they were receiving even before the conflict information about Ukraine and Kiev from Moscow sources. So the people actually lived in a double reality. They were Ukrainian citizens, paid with Ukrainian money, abiding or not abiding Ukrainian laws, but reading Russian literature, watching Russian TV, find out about Ukraine from Russian sources, and thus not associating themselves actually with Kiev, with Ukraine as the state. And that's why actually their identity was not Ukrainian, and it was not exactly Russian, but it was more like Soviet identity, because they were thinking that life before was better. The idea, the cult of great industrial region of Donbass, which was famous in the Soviet Union, was like injected in them also by local politicians who wanted to keep these regions as their election grounds, not letting other political parties from other regions to come and to open offices there. So it's very important to understand that Ukraine is huge. It has the size of France. It has 26 regions. Some of the regions are very different from the central ones. I mean, we have multinational region of Transcarpathia, where 300,000 people live and write and speak Hungarian. They're Ukrainian Hungarians. We have there Romanians, people from Slovakia, 4 different groups of Roma people, Ukrainians, Russians, etc. And of course, I mean, in every region, there are some specific problems of identity, and where the Ukrainian government is working on bringing this identity under the umbrella of Ukrainian citizenship and loyalty to the Ukrainian country. It works fine. Yeah, where Kiev had no influence for different reasons, these actually regions lost their Ukrainian identity or partially lost it. And now the main issue for Ukraine is to get them back, actually, to tell them, to show that they have the same rights, they are the same Ukrainians, but they should be loyal to their country. Because, I mean, geopolitically, from the point of view of the laws, and financially, they were loyal. And to explain it, it is not always easy, of course, especially abroad, because the Russian propaganda, actually, organizations are always stressing that Russia is defending Russian-speaking minority of Ukraine. I mean, Russian-speaking minority is not ethnic minority. I mean, I am ethnic Russian, so I should belong to Russian minority of Ukraine. But I mean, there are lots of thousands and thousands of Greeks, Armenians and others who are Russian speakers, and speaking Russian language doesn't define political view. I am pro-European, and I think probably 60–70% of Russian-speaking Ukrainians are actively pro-European. But there are, of course, maybe 20–30% of Russian speakers who are not pro-Russian, for different reasons, but very often because of the propaganda, because of the TV channels they watch. Because they are disrespect also for the Ukrainian language, because as well as in Latvia, we have Russian speakers in Ukraine who refuse to learn or to speak Ukrainian, although everybody understands Ukrainian, because in state media, in private TV channels and in radio, there is a quota, 70% or 75% of Ukrainian language everywhere, every day. So even in the Hungarian-speaking regions, you have Ukrainian language present in media.
I wanted to ask about internet as a new information space. Is it does it make things easier, or it's another problem in these information wars?
Well, I can start maybe and pass it on to Mr. Petenka. I mean, internet became the best place for disinformation. Because the fake news are actually planted first in internet, and then they are quoted from internet as real news.
Well, I think internet is just an instrument, as well as TV or radio, and I don't think that if we lived in 80s, for example, and we didn't have internet, but the television was so strong as it was, the situation was other. I think Russians will influence East Donbass with television, having no internet. So, of course, medium is the message, but internet even makes it more difficult for Russians because it's free. They can't control it. Nobody can control internet. And of course, for the first several years, we were shocked with how the fake news were spread within the internet. Europe was shocked. Media like BBC, CNN were shocked because they have to overcheck the news they checked before, and overcheck and overcheck. But now it seems that almost everybody understands the situation with internet, and the number of real fake news is less than it was 3 years ago. Now we have a problem of fake experts and fake organizations, not fake news, within the large media entities like international TV channels or national-wide media. So now we live in reality when not the information, the news itself can change something, but the fake organizations try to influence and try to create narratives, not news but narratives. And internet still stays as an instrument more or less effective according to the target audience, because it is effective when we talk about people maybe of my age, but teenagers are less influential with internet. They have too much disinformation, they stop believing any of it. More people who are 40 years and more, they are more influenced by TV, it seems to me. So internet is just an instrument, and it can be itself more harmful than any other instrument of media.
No, but I meant that internet is more democratic field comparing to television, which is very hierarchical tool. But I noticed many non-governmental organizations in Ukraine which are dealing with fake news issues and combating them. Is it something what people do as activists?
Yes, we have NGOs, we have activists and volunteers, informational volunteers. They did a tremendous job in 2014 to 15, 16. After that, a lot of them went to state work. Our ministry, together with other authorities, began more systematically work with these NGOs. For example, now we publish their research, now we publish brochures about informational war, which were created by Inform Napalm, Stop Terror, Stop Fake. If we talk about these 5 years of war with Russia, we had a period when society was, NGOs, experts were leading and were creating this field for struggle with information war. But when we talk about state and what Andrei told about geopolitical sphere, financial sphere, legal sphere, of course, state created instruments for implementing these society's ideas, society's research, and further working with it, because it is more effective when state and society collaborate. And now we have, right now, these 2 last years, we have this, I think, more effective situation of collaboration between society, NGOs, and state authorities with fighting the information war.
Maria, I wanted to ask you, knowing that you are running for European Parliament now, I wanted to ask what we in the European Union can do to help Ukrainians in this information war.
Thank you. Actually, I wanted to react to some of the things you asked before, and also to the discussion you had with Artem about the role of the internet, but this goes nicely with your question too. I think when they invented the printing press, I'm sure people had lots of concerns, and some of the concerns were legitimate. For example, you could really make more texts quicker with printing press than writing by hand, and some of the concerns were exaggerated simply because of the novelty of the medium. I think in the same way, some of the concerns we have about the internet are quite real and legitimate, and some are, of course, partly due to the relative novelty of the form. Because I do applaud, actually, the work of people working to counter, basically to counter fake news, as some of the groups in Ukraine, some of the websites you mentioned have done for some time now. But unfortunately, with the internet, just like with the printing press previously, it's a different form of spreading information. So it's very important to always have a very deep understanding of how actually this information is spreading. And we know from many studies, and we know from the companies themselves who run social media platforms, that what they do is, by algorithms, send you more of the type of the information you like. So it's quite important to keep our focus on that. And when we think about addressing our societies about what is sort of wrong on the internet, as you know probably this meme, it's very important to keep the focus not so much on just some individual fake news or so-called alternative facts, as we know from recent political discourse, but more on the fact that social media platforms are serving us with the kind of information we like and stopping us indirectly from seeing the kind of information we may not like. So, for example, if you are voting Democratic in the United States, you're not likely to get many posts by people you know if they support a Republican candidate, etc., and the other way around. So what we actually have here is social media, because they want you to click more, they want you to see more, they want you to stay longer on their platforms. they send you this information which you like. It's, you know, it's not my discovery, obviously. It's something you can read in many places these days. There are lots of studies on that. So what we can do in Europe, I think, if we have enough people who are concerned, is continue our dialogue with the big social media companies and try to convince them not to use that kind of algorithm. And of course, that is a highly difficult conversation because they expect to get more profit by using this kind of algorithm. They expect people to stay longer on their platforms. And how do you convince them that that's, you know, not a very good thing for our societies? Because it fragments our societies. We only get to see what people like us think and believe. We do not get to see what people who are not like us think and believe. Of course, maybe I'm exaggerating slightly, but not too much. That is the real issue. So I think maintaining our dialogue with social media platforms to try to, you know, to be a little bit more socially and politically responsible towards us all, towards European societies, towards societies globally. By not doing that, of course, would be great.
Maybe in the near future we will understand that separated information flows are the same kind of separatism as when people of different skin color were put in different trains. Anyone has something to add to it? Or
well, I wanted not to add to this point, but to mention one word which is very important, and we didn't mention it yet, or maybe mentioned but not enough. The word is tolerance, and tolerance is very much attached to the freedom of expression, freedom of thought, etc. And tolerance becomes the first victim of war, always. And we have an issue now when people are radicalized because of the war, because they can be easily divided into camps, two camps, both, one can say pro-Ukrainian, but one desiring to stop the war as quick as possible, the others understanding that the only way to stop the war is to give in and to accept what was done to Ukraine by Russia. And actually Russia is, I think, manipulating both camps, trying to make this divide even bigger, and the people stop being tolerant, stop listening to each other. Although I think they could participate in the long, even endless discussion on their stance, on their positions, but it's better to have discussions, even fruitless, than to have in the end the society divided in two parts, which one part doesn't tolerate another part. And how to deal with it? We are trying to deal with it in Ukrainian pen. It's extremely difficult because we recently issued an appeal to sort of defended a person who was not enemy of Ukraine, maybe he's not very educated or clever, but he wanted to show that he is for the peace and against any kind of military solution for the conflicts. But we defended only the fact that he has freedom to say this or to express his thoughts. And we were, in Pan-Ukraine, attacked and called separatists by the patriots of Ukraine. So, I mean, the issue of tolerance is gone out of debate. I mean, it's not present in the air anymore. And if you can advise us how to actually reinstate this respect to others' opinion, to the opposite opinion, if it is not opinion of somebody who is against your country, but somebody inside your country, inside your society, but has opposite opinion, like conservatives can have completely opposite opinion from the representatives of democratic or social democratic parties.
I wanted to ask, do you have a blacklist of Russian books not allowed to Ukraine now?
Yes, we have. We have about 300 such books, and these are books actually which are considered officially anti-Ukrainian because they have either anti-Ukrainian propaganda or they are promoting special operations of Russian Secret Service, or they are promoting Russian army, which is not applicable for Ukrainian readers, I think. but there are also books which are falsifying Ukrainian history, and they are also brought from Russia to Ukraine. But at the same time, the Russian publisher who wants to sell his books in Ukraine has to apply with every book for a license. And Russians learned how to apply with no problems, so there are more than 10,200 licenses given for legal sales of Russian books. So 10,000 allowed books and 300 not allowed books. It's not a war.
Do we have any questions in audience? I could give a microphone to you.
I have a question. Thank you very much. I'm Nadezhda Kalaus, Latvian Public Television. Thank you very much for the discussion, for your thoughts. Actually, I just wanted to ask about, maybe you could reflect on your thoughts on paradox which we have in the Western world. We are being very honest. We have these democratic laws, and we cannot put bans so easily to Russian propaganda media. We had so many problems already with banning Sputnik internet platforms, or now we have these Russian television channels. But Russia, in its own territory, doesn't actually bother much with putting bans on your books or any. But can we, with being such honest and following these democratic values, can we actually fight? And we are like totally not winning in this information war. And second thought is about what Ms. Gaila said, that like her readers are very clever, but we are speaking about ordinary people who are just watching on a daily basis Russian television channels. How can we reach them? I mean, clever people, highly educated people, I mean, they do read books already, and those people, they can see the difference already between biased media, between Russian propaganda and obvious reality. So how can we reach that masses which are really like, they like to listen to Mr. Putin and they agree with many things. We can speak and we can like talk here, but what to do to get any gains in this information war? Maybe Mr. Popov or information minister maybe. Thank you.
The situation is completely different when we talk about Ukraine and Europe, for example, because Ukraine is in the state of war, and of course, in such a state, there is no paradox. There are enemies who should be banned and who are against your country, and as well as it was in Great Britain, for example, in 1940, 41, there should be very specific bans for specific movies, books, radio, television, and so on. When we talk about Europe, which is not in a kind of war, the only answer for this paradox is education. So the state as entity, as authority, has to invest into education of its citizens and teaching them how to check the facts, how to watch TV, how to surf in the internet. Russia today, despite investing billions and billions of euros, is not the most popular channel in many countries. For example, in Great Britain, they don't have good ratings, but still they invest. And what does the government invest? Invest into the education and telling people that, okay, they could be present in our information field, but you don't have to believe into what they say. You have to check, because it's Russians. They 70% they lie. They try to create narratives which look like truthful, but they are not. And education is the only answer in democratic state. You can't ban something without being accused of building the same dictatorship. So educating, educating, and educating, and that's what we are trying. Despite we are in a state of war, we invest mostly into educating, into trainings, into printing books, into creating documentary movies about real situation in Donbass. So I don't know other answers for these products, legal answers, democratic answers.
Well, you know that you can watch BBC Channel 5 French or CNN in Russia, but people don't watch it, so they trust their own television. At the same time, Russian authorities are defending internet space in Russia from influence by Ukrainian or foreign websites which are telling the truth or trying to persuade Russian readers that not everything they believe in is true. So, I mean, we have dozens of Ukrainian websites which are blocked in Russia. And the paradox is to show that Russia is not completely authoritarian. There are Russian websites which are blocked in Russia but allowed abroad, like Grani.ru. You can access this opposition website in Ukraine, in Germany, but you cannot access it in Russia. So I think internet still has potential as an instrument to influence Russian society, but it is difficult. And I mean, the one more thing which is more, maybe sounds like anecdotal, but we should understand also the difference between Russian and Ukrainian mentality. Historical political matrix of Russia is monarchy. Russians love their Tsar. When they are fed up with their Tsar, they kill him and love the next one. And Russians all have the same image of Great Russia in their head. Ukraine is the product of historical matrix of democratic anarchy, of Cossacks. So, I mean, there were no monarchies in Ukraine, so there is no respect for the government, for the president. Ukrainians elect the president and next day they hate him because he hasn't done anything important overnight. At the same time, every Ukrainian has his own picture of future Ukraine which he would like to live in. And I mean, I think we could play with this difference of mentalities, but the problem is that the eastern part of Ukraine has Russian collective mentality which should be worked on.
I'm Andris Kovic, President of the European Movement in Latvia. The title says Combating Propaganda in a Post-Truth Era. I would like to ask, some people say we always, if there is a war, we have experienced a war, Ukraine is still in a hot war, actually Russia is in a hot war with Ukraine. In Latvia we prepare now for a situation which was fitting the last wars. So we're now preparing for green men arriving in Latvia, what would we do, how to deal with such a situation. Our army is preparing for situations like that. But smart people say we should prepare for the new ways of war, which are going to be the next ones, which are definitely going to be using different tools, different methods, different ways. Knowing that we have a neighbor in the east who is anti-democratic, anti-European, and who has several times already been using different types of war techniques against its neighbors, what would be you as writers and politicians? Writers and politicians tend to feel very well what's happening and what might be also some future scenarios or what might be situations which someone might try out as the next type of war in case if we would face one. What would be your feelings about possible next scenarios and what can we do as society, democratic European societies in Ukraine and Latvia now for preparing and perhaps avoiding future wars? And education, of course, is one piece of it, but perhaps there is a better understanding of what the next dangers for us might be. as a society, as a European and democratic society?
Well, I would not like to speculate on the dangers for Latvia, but what I can say that from 2013-14, a lot of Ukrainian writers who were not politically engaged at all before started doing more journalistic and essayistic jobs than writing novels. And I think this is a symptom that if the society is on edge of upheaval, of difficult times, you will see migration of writers from fiction to non-fiction, from non-fiction to journalism, to essayism. This is already some kind of defense. The writers are first to react to the social, economical and international political problems. So they are trying to bring the topics into the public domain, into the public open discussion. And I think in such a time, the public discussion, the important issues should be discussed by all the newspapers, mass media, television, and the topics should be present in the air for the whole of population, so that people who are even ordinary and not necessarily well educated at least could know and name the topics which are now important for their country. So, to find these topics and to highlight them, you have writers, but you have also journalism and politicians, and many politicians are also political writers.
Well, you don't have to go far, just read books, memoirs about Second World War. The situation now in Europe looks a lot like it was in the 30s, in the previous century. Russia built almost the same political system as it was in Nazi Germany. They feel their loss for some war in the 90s, and they would like revenge. There is a division in Europe, which is better, democracy or autocracy. A lot of Russian money are in Europe already. So it looks very like it was in the 30s. And I think that it's just a question of coincidence of different historical facts, which can grow into a big war, or maybe it won't begin. Nobody knows what will happen. But the situation in Russia and their mood is very likely like it was in previous century, and their ideas to rule the world, to show the real Russian world to everybody. You can feel it here, I think. So Europe has to be ready for any scenario, and we all have to be ready. And Ukraine feels like maybe the Czech felt in 1938 when Sudets were taken. That's it.
Yeah, maybe what I would say would sound really naive, but I think that right is not a very good advisor, and of course when it's war and Ukrainians have war, you should fight. What else you can do? But at the same time, I think we, as a girl and woman asked about the paradox of this society, is that we should. I think the thing which we should be grown-ups and be responsible for our own deeds, each our own separate ones. Start with that, and I think that is a good place to start, and to open more and more place for different people, stories and talks, and to be tolerant more and listen to the other side as well, to the people who are not reading, educate them, understand them more and more. Why are they not reading? Tell them about good sides of reading and so on. I don't know whether I was understandable, but
well, maybe one more thing to add is that in such a situation, building a national identity is very important. So, I mean, the more problem the country has, the better the country should know its own history.
Yeah, it goes back to this education thing that is very important, I think.
Well, I would add that it's also very important that rather than just be paralyzed of our expectation of what those who do not like democracy and who do not like Europe might do, it's very important that we keep our locus also on our responsibility to stay European and to stay democratic. I would not quite agree on this point with Artem Bedenko that Europe is divided between those who like democracy and those who like authoritarianism. I think Viktor Orban and his party and Matteo Salvini and his party do not make up for half of Europe. I honestly think that the majority of European citizens, and Eurobarometer data supports this, are still very much in favor of democracy, and it's very important not to be defeatist. I think it's very important also answering the Latvian public media journalist question. I think it's very important not to be defeatist and not to say it doesn't look like we're winning the information war. Luckily, it also doesn't look like we're losing the information war. I think European citizens, for the most part, do appreciate the democratic achievements of Europe and of their own countries. So it's important also not to feel like we are very weak and the others are very strong. I mean, we have to be careful, but we don't have to necessarily be defeatist. I think that's very important for us to remember.
Any more questions?